Deep in the Montana mountains, a sprawling cattle ranch sat abandoned, its barbed wire fences rusting under the weight of a terrible secret. 18-year-old Fiona walked out of the state orphanage when a lawyer's letter shattered everything she believed. Her father had not abandoned her. He had died trying to reach her, leaving behind that remote ranch, a legacy meant to give her the life he never could. But when she arrived to claim her inheritance, she discovered the crushing betrayal. Her uncle, a man she never knew existed, had sold the ranch to a powerful development company years ago, stealing a fortune that should have been hers. The deed was gone. The land was gone. And with it, her father's final gift. How could blood family betray her before she even knew they existed? What had her father been hiding in those remote mountains? And was there any way for an orphaned girl with nothing to reclaim what was rightfully hers? The morning Fiona turned 18, the Montana State Home for Children felt different, not in its physical form, but in the weight of finality that pressed against her chest with every breath. She stood in the narrow room that had been hers for the past decade, a space barely large enough for a twin bed and a scarred wooden dresser, sunlight streaming through the single window and illuminating the dust motes that danced in the stale air like tiny lost souls. Her possessions fit into a single worn duffel bag, a fact that should have felt liberating, but instead settled over her like a shroud of profound loneliness. At precisely 9 in the morning, Mrs. Winters, the orphanage director, knocked on her door with an unusual gentleness and handed her a thick cream-colored envelope embossed with the words Sterling and Associates, Attorneys at Law, Copper Ridge, Montana. Fiona's hands trembled as she opened it, the expensive paper crinkling under her fingers, and she read words that shattered the narrative of abandonment she had carried like a scar for 18 years. Her father, James Garrison, had not walked away from her as an infant, leaving her on the orphanage steps as she had been told in the vague, uncomfortable conversations that punctuated her childhood. He had died 5 years ago, in a remote Montana town, and in death, he had left her something she had never possessed in life, a legacy, a 2,000-acre cattle ranch nestled in the mountains, a piece of earth that was meant to be hers. The letter from Mr. Sterling was both clinical and compassionate, explaining that James had spent 15 years searching for her through a bureaucratic maze of lost paperwork and system failures, never stopping, never forgetting, until a riding accident in the canyon country took his life before he could complete his desperate mission. The ranch, the letter stated, had been held in trust, waiting for the day she turned 18 and could legally claim her inheritance. Fiona read the letter 3 times, her vision blurring with tears she refused to let fall in front of Mrs. Winters, who watched with an expression of surprised confusion. By noon, she was on a Greyhound bus heading west, the Montana landscape unfolding outside her window, like a promise written in stone and sky. The peaks of distant mountains rising against the horizon, jagged and eternal. She carried nothing but the duffel bag, $83 in cash, the lawyer's letter folded carefully in her jacket pocket, and a photograph she had been given years ago. A faded image of a man she did not remember, standing beside a horse, his face weathered and kind, the father who had never stopped searching, who had left her a home she had never seen. The office of Sterling and Associates occupied the 2nd floor of a brick building on Copper Ridge's main street, a modest space that smelled of old leather and wood polish, where the autumn sun slanted through tall windows and painted golden rectangles across a worn carpet. Mr. Sterling was a man in his 60s with kind, tired eyes, and hands that fidgeted with a pen as Fiona sat across from his desk, her heart still buoyant with the fragile hope that had carried her across 3 states. The hope died the moment the office door opened, and a man walked in, tall and expensively dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than everything Fiona had ever owned. His silver hair, perfectly styled, his face a harder, colder version of the man in her faded photograph. This was Derek Garrison, her uncle, family she had never known existed, and the way his pale blue eyes assessed her, calculating and dismissive, sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the temperature. Sterling's voice, when he finally spoke, was heavy with reluctance and what might have been guilt, explaining that when James died 5 years ago, with no apparent heirs, Derek, as the only surviving family member, had petitioned the court to be named executor of the estate. The lawyer's words came slowly, each one a hammer blow against the fragile structure of Fiona's dreams. Derek had argued that Fiona was lost in the system, untraceable, that a reasonable search had been conducted and failed, and the court, faced with a decaying property and mounting back taxes, had granted him control. 3 years ago, Derek had sold the ranch to Apex Land Development Corporation for $4.2 million, a transaction that was legal, binding, and according to every document Sterling spread across his desk with shaking hands, completely airtight. Fiona felt the room tilt, her vision narrowing to a tunnel, as the magnitude of the theft, for that was what it was regardless of legality, crashed over her like a wave of ice water. Derek leaned against the window frame, his posture radiating smug satisfaction, and when he finally spoke, his voice was smooth and utterly devoid of warmth. He suggested that Fiona should be grateful he had liquidated what he called a burden, that he had paid the estate's debts and taxes, and that her appearance now, after all these years, was unfortunately too late to change anything. Sterling interjected weakly, mentioning that there might be a small settlement from the remaining estate funds, perhaps $10,000 after legal fees, a pittance compared to the millions her uncle had pocketed. Fiona sat frozen, her hands gripping the arms of the chair, staring at this stranger who shared her blood and had stolen her father's final gift with the casual efficiency of a man who had done such things before. The inheritance was gone. The land was gone, sold to faceless developers, and with it vanished the home her father had built, the legacy he had died trying to leave her, reduced to nothing but a check that would not cover a year's rent in any city. She had traveled 1,000 miles to claim her birthright, and found only ashes and a well-dressed thief wearing the mask of family. Fiona refused to leave Copper Ridge, a decision that seemed to surprise both Sterling and her uncle, who had clearly expected her to slink back to wherever orphans disappeared to when their hopes were crushed. She used a portion of her meager savings to check into the Pineview Motel, a sad collection of faded blue cabins at the edge of town, where the nightly rate was $28, and the sheets smelled of industrial detergent and loneliness. The next morning, driven by a need she could not articulate, she walked down the main street to May's Diner, a chrome and red vinyl establishment that looked like it had been transported whole from the 1950s and planted at the base of the mountains. The breakfast crowd was sparse, a handful of ranchers in worn denim and weathered faces, men who looked up from their eggs and coffee as she entered, their eyes following her with an intensity that felt less like curiosity and more like assessment. She sat at the counter and ordered coffee from a waitress who could not have been older than 25, then began asking questions about James Garrison in a voice she tried to keep steady. The response was immediate and uncomfortable, a subtle shift in the atmosphere as conversations quieted and eyes looked away. The ranchers were polite, offering generic condolences, saying James had been a good man, a fair neighbor, but their words felt rehearsed, and their gazes held something she could not quite name, a wariness that suggested they knew more than they were willing to share with a stranger. It was the owner, a woman who emerged from the kitchen wiping her hands on her apron, who changed everything. May was perhaps 70 years old, with steel-grey hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, a face carved by decades of Montana sun and wind, and pale blue eyes that studied Fiona with an intensity that made her feel transparent. May walked slowly to the counter, leaned against it with the ease of someone who had occupied that space for 50 years, and spoke in a voice that was low and deliberate. She said that Fiona looked just like her father, had his eyes and the same stubborn set to her jaw, and that James Garrison had been one of the finest men she had ever known, honest, hard-working, and devoted to the land. But then May's expression shifted, a shadow passing across her weathered features, and she added that James had been a man who asked too many questions, who looked too closely at things that powerful people wanted left alone, and that his death, ruled an accident by the county coroner, had left a lot of folks in town with doubts they were afraid to voice. The way she said it, the deliberate emphasis on the word accident, the meaningful look she gave Fiona before turning back to the kitchen, was not information, but a warning, a message delivered in the coded language of a small town where speaking the truth out loud could be dangerous. May returned from the kitchen 20 minutes later, carrying a fresh pot of coffee and a look of quiet determination, sliding onto the stool beside Fiona as the morning crowd thinned and the diner settled into the slow rhythm of mid-morning emptiness. She poured 2 cups, adding cream to her own with the automatic gesture of ritual, and asked Fiona a question that seemed to come from nowhere, whether she knew that her father had owned a dog. Fiona shook her head, feeling the familiar ache of all the things she would never know about James Garrison, all the details of a life she had been denied. May's weathered face softened as she explained that the dog, a German shepherd named Ranger, had been James's constant companion for the last 4 years of his life, a loyal shadow who had accompanied him on every ride across the ranch, who had slept on the porch of the ranch house and waited at the gate each evening for his master's return. When James died, May continued, her voice dropping to something almost reverent. The dog had grieved, refusing to eat for days until May coaxed him back to life with patience and soft words. Ranger had lived with May ever since. Now 9 years old, his once dark coat faded to a striking blend of silver grey and pale cream, like winter frost on mountain stone, his muzzle white with age, but his amber eyes still sharp and watchful. May asked if Fiona would like to meet him, and without waiting for an answer, she led her through the diner's back door into a small fenced yard where an old shepherd lay in a patch of sunlight, his massive head resting on his paws. May called his name softly, and the dog rose with the careful deliberation of age, his ears pricking forward as he studied the young woman standing beside his caretaker. Fiona knelt slowly, extending her hand, palm up, a gesture she had learned from a counselor at the orphanage, who had briefly kept a therapy dog, and held her breath as Ranger approached with measured steps, his nose working, cataloguing her scent with the thoroughness of a creature whose entire world was built on such information. The dog sniffed her hand once, twice, then stilled completely, his intelligent eyes meeting hers with an intensity that felt almost human. What happened next defied explanation, a moment of recognition that passed between them like an electric current, as Ranger pressed his broad head against her leg and leaned his full weight into her, a gesture of trust and acceptance that was absolute and unquestioning. May, watching from the doorway, felt tears slip down her weathered cheeks as she whispered the words that confirmed what they both somehow knew, that this dog, who had been wary of strangers for 5 years, who had mourned his master with a depth that transcended simple animal loyalty, had recognized something essential in Fiona's scent, her voice, her presence. "He knows you're Jim's daughter," May said, her voice breaking on the words, and Fiona, kneeling in the dirt with her father's dog pressed against her, finally let herself cry for the man she had never known, and the inheritance that had been stolen before she ever had the chance to claim it. With Ranger sitting in the passenger seat of May's borrowed pickup truck, his grey and white head held high as he stared through the windshield, with an intensity that suggested he understood exactly where they were going. Fiona followed the directions Sterling had reluctantly provided, driving 12 miles north of town on a 2-lane highway that climbed steadily into the mountains before turning onto a dirt road that wound through dense stands of pine and aspen. The road grew rougher with each passing mile, the truck bouncing over ruts and stones until they rounded a final bend, and she saw it, a massive steel gate that stretched across the road like a fortress wall, its bars thick as a man's wrist, topped with curls of razor wire that glinted in the afternoon sun. Heavy chains secured the gate, wrapped multiple times and fastened with an industrial padlock the size of her fist, and bolted to the metal were multiple signs in bold red letters reading Apex Development Corporation, private property, no trespassing, violators will be prosecuted. Fiona killed the engine and stepped out, Ranger immediately leaping down beside her with a grace that defied his age, and together they approached the gate, her hands gripping the cold steel as she peered through the bars at the landscape beyond. The road continued for perhaps a quarter-mile, climbing a gentle rise, and there at the crest she could see it, the distant outline of a house, a sturdy log structure with a stone chimney and a wide porch, surrounded by outbuildings and corrals, the home her father had built, the inheritance that had been stolen while it was still legally hers. Ranger began to whine, a low, urgent sound that vibrated in his chest, his body trembling as he pressed against the gate and pawed at the steel with his front feet, scratching uselessly at the barrier that separated him from the land he had once roamed freely. The dog's distress was profound and unmistakable, and Fiona felt an answering ache in her own chest as she stood there, staring at the home she would never enter. The legacy reduced to a view through prison bars. They stood that way for perhaps 10 minutes, woman and dog united in their loss, before she heard the sound of an engine growing louder, the rumble of a heavy vehicle approaching from the other side of the gate. A white pickup truck with Apex Security emblazoned on the door appeared over the rise, driving fast and kicking up a trail of dust, and skidded to a stop just beyond the gate. A man stepped out, young and broad-shouldered, wearing a uniform that tried too hard to look official, his hand resting on something at his belt that might have been a radio or might have been something worse. He ordered her to leave immediately, his voice sharp with authority, stating that this was private property, and she was trespassing on a public road just by standing there. Fiona met his eyes, preparing to argue, to explain who she was and what had been taken from her. But what she saw in his face stopped the words in her throat. It was not just the hardness of a man doing his job, or the irritation of an interrupted patrol, but something deeper and more unsettling, a flicker of genuine fear that danced behind his aggressive posture, as if he was afraid not of her, but of what might happen if he failed to make her leave. Tom Whitaker's name came from May, whispered across the diner counter with another of those meaningful looks that seemed to be the currency of truth in Copper Ridge, and Fiona found him 2 days later living in a small, weathered cabin on the outskirts of town, a place where the forest pressed close and the nearest neighbor was a mile away. He was a man in his 70s, lean and sun-darkened like a piece of old leather, with gnarled hands that had spent a lifetime working rope and reins, and when he opened his door to find Fiona standing there, with Ranger at her side, his weathered face went through a series of emotions so rapid and profound that she thought he might collapse. He invited them in without a word, his eyes locked on the dog who approached him with a soft whine of recognition. And for several minutes the old foreman simply sat in his chair, stroking Ranger's greying head, tears running unashamedly down his weathered cheeks, as he murmured that he never thought he would see Jim's dog again, never thought he would meet Jim's daughter. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion, and something darker, something that sounded like guilt that had been festering for 5 years. He told Fiona that her father had been the finest man he had ever worked for, fair and honest, and devoted to the land with a passion that bordered on reverence, but James had also been observant, the kind of man who noticed when things were not right. About 6 months before his death, Tom explained, James had been riding the northern boundary of the ranch, checking on the high country streams that fed down into the valley, when he discovered something that did not belong there. Evidence of dumping, of waste being buried in places where it would leach into the watershed and poison everything downstream. James had started documenting what he found, taking photographs, collecting samples, keeping meticulous records in a journal he carried everywhere, and he had become increasingly agitated as he realized the scope of what was happening on his land. Tom's voice dropped to barely above a whisper as he continued, explaining that James had told him he was going to take his evidence to the Environmental Protection Agency, that he had finally gathered enough proof to force an investigation, and that he had a meeting scheduled with an EPA investigator for the week after he died. The official story, the one the county coroner Dr. Raymond Price had signed off on, was that James had suffered an accidental fall while riding alone in Blackstone Canyon, that his horse had spooked and thrown him, and that he had struck his head on the rocks, dying instantly from the trauma. Tom's hands clenched into fists as he spoke, his voice rising with anger that had been suppressed for half a decade. He looked Fiona directly in the eyes and stated with absolute conviction that her daddy did not fall, that James Garrison was the best horseman in 3 counties, a man who had been riding since he was old enough to walk, who could handle any mount in any terrain, who would never have been thrown by a spook or a stumble. Tom had gone to the canyon after they found the body, had studied the scene with eyes that knew horses and riders, and everything about it felt wrong. The placement of the body, the lack of tracks showing a spooked horse, the convenient remoteness of the location. He had wanted to raise questions, to demand a real investigation, but within days of the funeral, Derek Garrison had appeared, had fired Tom and the other ranch hands, and had made it clear that anyone who caused trouble would face consequences that went beyond mere unemployment. Tom's voice broke as he admitted his cowardice, his failure to speak up when it mattered, and he looked at Fiona with eyes that begged for understanding, if not forgiveness. A man haunted by the truth he had been too afraid to tell. Tom rose from his chair with the stiff movements of a man whose body had been broken by decades of hard labor, and pieced back together with determination and regret, walking to a closet in the corner of his small cabin, where he moved aside a stack of old blankets and winter coats to reveal a battered leather saddlebag, the kind cowboys had used for generations to carry supplies on long rides. He lifted it with trembling hands, the leather cracked and darkened with age and oil, and carried it back to the table where he set it down between them with a heaviness that had nothing to do with its physical weight. His voice, when he spoke, was barely above a whisper, a confession delivered in the fading light of afternoon, as shadows lengthened across the worn floorboards. He told Fiona that on the day of James's funeral, before Derek had arrived to claim the ranch and dismiss the staff, Tom had gone to the ranch house one final time and found this saddlebag hanging in the tack room, where James always kept it, and acting on an instinct he could not explain, he had taken it and hidden it in his cabin, too terrified to look inside, too guilty to destroy it, carrying the weight of its unknown contents for 5 long years like a stone around his neck. Now, with hands that shook so badly he could barely work the brass buckles, he opened the saddlebag and withdrew a leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth by James's hands, its pages filled with neat, precise handwriting that covered every line with the methodical care of a man building a case. Fiona took the journal with reverence, feeling the weight of her father's last thoughts in her hands, and began to read, the words on the pages painting a picture of discovery and growing horror that unfolded over months of careful investigation. The entries began 2.5 years before James's death, noting strange activity on the northern section of the ranch, heavy truck traffic on remote access roads that should have been empty, and disturbed earth in areas far from any legitimate construction or ranching activity. James had started documenting everything, taking photographs with a camera whose images he described in detail, collecting water samples from the mountain streams that showed discoloration and chemical odors, recording dates and times and vehicle descriptions with the thoroughness of a man who understood he was building evidence that powerful people would want destroyed. The journal revealed that James had identified the waste as coming from Apex Land Development Corporation's urban demolition projects, construction debris laced with asbestos, lead paint, industrial solvents, and other toxins that should have been disposed of in licensed hazardous waste facilities, but were instead being illegally dumped on remote mountain land where no one was supposed to notice. The entries grew more urgent as James realized the full scope of the contamination. That the streams feeding down from his ranch supplied water to neighboring properties, and eventually to the town itself. Then this was not just a crime against his land, but a threat to the health and safety of hundreds of people. He wrote about making contact with an EPA investigator named Sarah Chen, about sending her preliminary evidence, about her promise to come to Montana and conduct a site inspection if he could provide exact locations and photographic proof. The final entry, dated the day before James died, was written in his characteristic neat script, but with an undercurrent of excitement that practically vibrated off the page. 3 simple sentences that would become his epitaph. Meeting with EPA investigator tomorrow at the ranch. Finally have enough proof to force a full investigation. This ends now. The next page was blank. The investigation that never happened. The justice that died with him in Blackstone Canyon. Fiona returned to Sterling's office the next morning, carrying the journal wrapped carefully in a cloth bag, Ranger waiting patiently in May's truck outside, and the lawyer's face went pale as he read through the entries, his hands shaking slightly as he turned each page and absorbed the implications of what James Garrison had documented in such meticulous detail. Sterling sat back in his chair, removed his glasses to rub his tired eyes, and admitted in a voice heavy with regret that he had suspected something was wrong with the estate proceedings 5 years ago, that Derek's sudden appearance and aggressive push to close the sale had felt rushed and opportunistic, but he had been a small-town lawyer, facing a man with expensive attorneys from the city, and he had convinced himself that everything was legitimate, even as his instincts screamed otherwise. Now, with the journal spread before them, like evidence at a trial, Sterling suggested they review the original estate documents again, pulling out the thick file that bore James Garrison's name and spreading the papers across his desk in chronological order. They worked in silence for nearly an hour, Fiona watching as the lawyer's trained eyes moved over each document, comparing dates and details, until he paused at the power of attorney form that had given Derek the legal authority to act as executor of James's estate. Sterling reached for a magnifying glass from his desk drawer, the kind he used for reading fine print in contracts, and held it over the signature at the bottom of the page, studying the loops and curves of the handwriting with an intensity that made Fiona hold her breath. He said nothing for several long minutes, then pulled out another document from earlier in the file, a mortgage refinancing paper that James had signed 3 years before his death, and placed the 2 signatures side by side under the bright light of his desk lamp. The differences were subtle, the kind of thing that might escape a cursory glance, but became glaringly obvious under close scrutiny and comparison. The angle of the capital G in Garrison slightly different, the pressure of the pen inconsistent, the flow of the signature on the power of attorney form too smooth and practiced, lacking the natural variations that appeared in the genuine signature from the mortgage document. Sterling's voice, when he finally spoke, was careful and measured, the voice of a lawyer who understood the implications of what he was suggesting. He stated that, in his professional opinion, based on 30 years of reviewing legal documents, the signature on the power of attorney form authorizing Derek as executor appeared to be a forgery, skillfully done, but a forgery nonetheless, which meant that every action Derek had taken, including the sale of the ranch to Apex Development, had been based on fraudulent authority and could potentially be challenged in court. But then came the crushing reality that Sterling delivered with visible reluctance, explaining that proving forgery after 5 years would require a formal forensic document examination, an expensive process involving specialists who could analyze ink composition, paper aging, pressure patterns, and comparative handwriting samples, a process that would cost tens of thousands of dollars and require months of investigation before any court would even consider reopening the estate case. Fiona stared at the 2 signatures, so similar, yet so crucially different, understanding that she had found the key to reclaiming her inheritance, but lacked the resources to turn that key, trapped in the cruel irony that proving she had been robbed of millions would cost more money than she possessed in the world. Fiona returned to the Pineview Motel as dusk settled over Copper Ridge, the mountain peaks silhouetted against a sky that bruised from gold to purple to deep indigo, and she felt the weight of exhaustion settle into her bones as she unlocked the door to her small room, where Ranger immediately began his evening inspection, sniffing the corners and checking the bathroom with the thoroughness of a dog who understood that vigilance was not optional. She had barely kicked off her boots and sat down on the sagging bed when Ranger's entire demeanor changed, his body going rigid as a statue, his ears snapping forward, and a low, rumbling growl beginning to vibrate in his chest, a sound she had never heard from him before, deep and menacing and utterly focused on the door. Fiona rose slowly, her heart suddenly hammering against her ribs, and moved to the window, where she carefully pulled aside the thin curtain, just enough to see out into the parking lot. There, parked 3 spaces down, in a position that gave a clear view of her door, sat a dark blue pickup truck with its engine running and its headlights off. And in the driver's seat, she could make out the silhouette of a man, his face obscured by shadow, but his attention clearly fixed on her room. She stood frozen for several seconds, fear and anger warring in her chest, before moving to the ancient rotary phone on the nightstand and dialing 0 for the front desk, her voice shaking slightly as she told the night clerk that there was a suspicious vehicle in the parking lot and asked if he could come check on it. By the time the clerk emerged from the office, a portly man in his 60s, moving with the slow deliberation of someone who did not expect real trouble, the truck was already backing out of its space, turning without haste, and driving away into the darkness with its headlights still off. The clerk assured Fiona it was probably just someone who had pulled in to make a phone call or check a map, his tone suggesting he thought she was overreacting, and she did not argue, simply thanked him and retreated back into her room, where Ranger continued to pace, his anxiety unabated. She wedged the single chair under the door handle, checked the window lock twice, and tried to settle into an uneasy sleep with the television playing quietly for the illusion of company. But rest would not come. It was just after 2 in the morning when Ranger erupted from his position by the bed, his bark explosive and ferocious, a sound of pure territorial aggression that shattered the silence as he threw himself at the door, and Fiona jolted awake in time to see the door handle turning slowly, someone on the other side testing it, trying to gain entry. She scrambled for the phone, shouting that she was calling the police, and the handle immediately released, followed by the sound of rapid footsteps retreating across the gravel parking lot and a vehicle engine starting in the distance. She spent the rest of the night sitting upright, with her back against the headboard, Ranger pressed against her side, both of them staring at the door, until the first grey light of dawn crept through the curtains. When she finally opened the door to let Ranger out for his morning routine, she nearly stepped on it, a folded piece of paper that had been slipped underneath the door sometime in those last dark hours before sunrise, and her hands trembled as she unfolded it to reveal a message written in block letters with a black marker, 8 words that transformed her fear into a cold, clarifying rage. Go back to the city. Some inheritances aren't worth dying for. Fiona was sitting at the counter in May's diner the following morning, picking at a plate of eggs she had no appetite for while Ranger dozed at her feet, when a young woman slid onto the stool beside her, with the casual confidence of someone who belonged there, though Fiona had never seen her before in the week she had been haunting this place. The woman was perhaps 30 years old, Asian American with dark, intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, her black hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, dressed in jeans and a canvas jacket that had seen better days, and she carried a worn leather messenger bag that bulged with notebooks and file folders. She ordered coffee from May, with the familiarity of a regular, then turned to Fiona and introduced herself in a voice that was low and direct, stating that her name was Sarah Chen, that she was an investigative reporter for the Montana Regional Tribune, and that she had been waiting for someone like Fiona to appear in Copper Ridge for the past 2 years. Fiona's first instinct was suspicion, a wariness born of threatening notes and midnight visitors. But something in Sarah's eyes, a combination of fierce determination and genuine concern, made her pause and listen. Sarah explained that she had been investigating Apex Land Development Corporation since a series of suspicious property acquisitions had caught her attention, a pattern of rural landowners who had either sold their properties for far below market value or had lost them through foreclosure under circumstances that seemed orchestrated rather than organic. She had documented 12 cases across Montana where families had been systematically pressured off their land through legal harassment, sudden tax assessments, and in 3 cases, unexpected deaths ruled as accidents by the same county coroner who had signed off on James Garrison's death certificate. Sarah had built files, conducted interviews with former Apex employees who spoke only on condition of anonymity, and traced connections between the company and local officials that suggested a network of corruption far deeper than simple real estate fraud. When James died 5 years ago, Sarah had tried to investigate, had driven to Copper Ridge and asked questions, but she had hit a wall of silence, the town closing ranks in a way that told her people were afraid, and, without a family member to champion the case, without someone with legal standing to demand answers, her investigation had stalled. Now, with Fiona's arrival and her refusal to simply accept the theft of her inheritance, Sarah saw an opportunity to finally break the story open, to give voice to all the victims who had been silenced by fear or death. She reached into her messenger bag and pulled out a thick folder, spreading newspaper clippings and printed documents across the counter, showing Fiona the scope of what she had uncovered, the pattern of environmental violations at other Apex sites, the suspicious timing of Derek Garrison's involvement, the financial connections between Apex executives and county officials that suggested bribes disguised as consulting fees. Sarah's voice grew more animated as she spoke, explaining that she had contacts at the State Environmental Agency who had been waiting for concrete evidence to justify opening an investigation into Apex's operations. And more importantly, she had a friend from journalism school who had become a forensic document examiner, someone who owed Sarah a significant favor and who might be willing to analyze the estate documents that Sterling suspected were forged, doing the expensive work pro bono if it meant exposing a conspiracy that had victimized multiple families. For the first time since arriving in Copper Ridge, since learning that her inheritance had been stolen and her father had likely been murdered, Fiona felt the crushing isolation lift slightly, replaced by the fragile hope that she was no longer fighting this battle alone. Derek Garrison appeared at the Pineview Motel 2 days after Fiona's meeting with Sarah Chen, his expensive sedan looking absurdly out of place in the gravel parking lot as he stepped out and approached her door, just as she was returning from an afternoon walk with Ranger. And the sight of him sent a cold spike of adrenaline through her system, even as she forced herself to stand her ground. He looked different from their first meeting in Sterling's office, the polished veneer cracked and showing the strain beneath, his silver hair slightly disheveled, his white dress shirt wrinkled, and despite the cool mountain air that carried the bite of approaching autumn, there were visible beads of sweat on his forehead and upper lip. He smiled, but it was a terrible simulation of warmth, his lips stretched tight over his teeth as he said he had come to make her a generous offer, one that would solve all her problems and allow them both to move forward. He pulled a thick manila envelope from his jacket pocket, opened it to show her the contents, stacks of $100 bills bound with paper bands, $100,000 in cash that he was prepared to give her right now, immediately, if she would simply sign a document releasing any and all claims to the Garrison estate, and agree to leave Montana within 48 hours. His voice had the rehearsed quality of a prepared speech as he explained that this was far more money than she had any right to expect, that the legal sale of the ranch had been completed years ago, and that he was offering this settlement purely out of family obligation and a desire to avoid the unpleasantness of a protracted legal battle that she could not possibly win. Fiona looked from the money to her uncle's face, seeing the desperation there, barely concealed behind his attempt at magnanimity, and she said the single word that she knew would change everything. A simple and definitive no. Derek's expression shifted immediately, the mask of civility falling away to reveal something harder and more dangerous beneath, his pale eyes going cold as he stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low hiss that carried an unmistakable threat. He told her that she was playing a dangerous game, that she did not understand the forces she was interfering with, that Apex Land Development was not just a company, but an organization with resources and connections that extended far beyond what a naive girl from an orphanage could possibly comprehend. He leaned in closer, his breath carrying the sour smell of stress and whiskey, and said that people had gotten hurt interfering with Apex's projects, that accidents happened to those who asked too many questions or refused reasonable offers, and that her father should have been a lesson in what happened to stubborn men who did not know when to walk away. The moment the words left his mouth, the thinly veiled reference to James's death, Ranger moved with a speed that belied his age, positioning himself between Fiona and Derek, his body low and coiled, his lips pulled back to reveal impressive teeth, and a growl rumbling in his chest. There was not a warning, but a promise of violence if this man took one more step toward his master's daughter. Derek stumbled backward, his face going pale, and for a moment the expensive businessman was reduced to something primal, a man confronted by a predator and recognizing his own vulnerability. He retreated to his car, fumbling with the door handle, but before he drove away he rolled down the window and delivered his final message, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and fury, telling Fiona that she had made her choice and would have to live with the consequences, that he had tried to help her, but now, whatever happened next, was on her own head. Sarah's forensic document examiner was a woman named Dr. Linda Marsh, who worked out of a small laboratory in Missoula, a 3-hour drive from Copper Ridge, and she greeted them with the quiet professionalism of someone who had spent decades testifying in courtrooms and understood the weight that evidence could carry. She was perhaps 50 years old, with grey-streaked auburn hair and steady hands that handled the estate documents with the reverence of an archaeologist examining ancient artifacts, spreading them across a light table in her sterile white laboratory, while explaining the process she would use to determine authenticity. Sarah and Fiona watched in silence as Dr. Marsh employed a battery of techniques, examining the documents under various wavelengths of light, measuring the depth of pen pressure with specialized equipment, analyzing the ink composition through non-destructive chemical testing, and most tellingly, conducting a detailed comparison of the questioned signature against known exemplars of James Garrison's handwriting from the mortgage documents and old letters that Sterling had provided. The analysis took nearly 6 hours, Dr. Marsh working with the focused intensity of a surgeon, occasionally making notations in a leather-bound notebook, her expression growing increasingly grave as the evidence accumulated. When she finally turned from her equipment and removed her magnifying visor, her verdict was unequivocal and damning. The signature on the power of attorney document that had given Derek Garrison the authority to act as executor was a forgery, and not even a particularly sophisticated one, executed by someone with access to examples of James's signature, but lacking the skill to perfectly replicate the subtle variations and natural hesitations that characterized genuine handwriting. Dr. Marsh explained that the forger had likely used a tracing method, placing the document over an existing signature and following the lines, which resulted in a reproduction that looked superficially correct, but lacked the pressure variations and pen lift patterns that occurred when someone signed their own name, the kind of detail that escaped casual observation, but was glaringly obvious under forensic examination. She was prepared to write a formal report and testify to her findings in court, her professional reputation and credentials impeccable, which meant they now had concrete evidence that Derek's entire claim to the estate had been built on fraud. But it was Sarah who noticed the second critical detail, her reporter's eye catching something that had been hiding in plain sight tonight: the death certificate that Sterling had included in the case file. She pointed to the signature at the bottom of the document, the official determination that James Garrison had died from accidental trauma, and read aloud the name: Dr. Raymond Price, Flathead County Coroner. Sarah pulled out her laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she accessed the newspaper's archives, and within minutes she had found what she was looking for. A small article from 3 years ago reporting that Dr. Price had been quietly removed from his position as county coroner following an investigation by the state medical board that revealed he had falsified at least 7 autopsy reports over a 10-year period, ruling suspicious deaths as accidents in cases where families later proved foul play through independent autopsies. The article noted that several criminal cases had been reopened as a result of Price's malfeasance, but it made no mention of James Garrison, whose death had occurred before the investigation began. The pieces were falling into place with terrible clarity. A forged signature, a corrupt coroner, an illegal dumping operation, and a man who had died one day before meeting with an EPA investigator. They had evidence of fraud and strong suspicion of murder, but to build a case that would force law enforcement to act, that would overcome the local connections and power that Apex wielded, they needed the original physical evidence that James had collected, the photographs and water samples and location data that he had documented in his journal, evidence that had disappeared somewhere in the 5 years since his death. They planned the infiltration for a moonless night, when cloud cover would provide additional darkness, meeting at Sarah's rented cabin on the outskirts of town, where they spread topographical maps across the kitchen table and studied the northern boundary of the ranch property, where James's journal indicated the worst contamination existed. Sarah had acquired bolt cutters from a hardware store 2 towns over, paying cash to avoid any record, and Fiona wore dark clothing, borrowed from May, her heart hammering with a mixture of fear and determination as they loaded into Sarah's nondescript sedan with Ranger in the back seat, his ears alert and body tense as if he understood the gravity of their mission. They parked on a Forest Service road nearly 2 miles from the ranch boundary, hiking through dense timber in near total darkness, using only a single red-filtered flashlight that Sarah explained would preserve their night vision while being less visible from a distance. The fence, when they finally reached it after 40 minutes of stumbling through underbrush, was not the imposing steel barrier of the main gate, but a simpler barbed wire construction, old and rusted, and the bolt cutters made quick work of the lower strands, creating an opening large enough to crawl through. They were on garrison land now, technically trespassing, on property that should have been Fiona's by right of inheritance, and the irony was not lost on her as they navigated by compass bearing toward the coordinates James had noted in his journal. The terrain grew steeper, the forest giving way to rocky outcroppings and mountain meadows silvered by starlight, and it was Ranger who found it first, stopping abruptly and refusing to move forward, his body rigid and a low whine of distress emanating from his throat. Fiona knelt beside him, following his gaze downslope to where a small stream cut through the darkness, and when Sarah turned on her more powerful flashlight, directing the beam toward the water source, they saw it clearly. A concrete culvert pipe protruding from the hillside, half hidden by overgrown vegetation, but unmistakable in its industrial origin. And from its opening leaked a slow, steady flow of liquid that was not water, but something darker, thicker, leaving an oily sheen on the rocks below and staining the streambed with colors that had no place in nature. Sarah moved closer, her camera clicking rapidly as she documented the scene from multiple angles, the flash briefly illuminating the horror of what James had discovered, while Fiona used gloved hands to fill sealed sample containers with the contaminated water, her nose detecting the acrid chemical smell that made her eyes water even in the open air. Ranger refused to approach the stream, backing away with his tail tucked and his ears flat, his animal instincts recognizing poison that his human companions could only measure with instruments. They worked quickly and methodically, Sarah photographing the culvert's construction, the vegetation patterns that suggested years of continuous discharge, and the contamination spreading downstream toward the valley below, while Fiona collected soil samples from the immediate area and labeled each container with precise location data. They had been at the contamination site for perhaps 20 minutes, Sarah taking her final photographs, and Fiona sealing the last water sample in her backpack, when Ranger's head snapped up, and a low, urgent growl rumbled in his chest, his body oriented back toward the direction they had come. And in that same instant, they heard it, the distant sound of engines, and then the sweep of powerful searchlights cutting through the darkness like white knives, moving in a grid pattern that suggested a coordinated search. Sarah killed her flashlight immediately, plunging them into absolute darkness, and hissed a single word that galvanized them into motion. Run. They fled through the forest with the desperation of prey animals, stumbling over roots and crashing through undergrowth, the precious samples in Fiona's backpack bouncing against her spine with every stride. And behind them the lights grew brighter, and the engine sounds multiplied. At least 3 vehicles now, maybe more, converging on their position with the systematic efficiency of a professional security operation. It was Ranger who saved them, the old dog taking the lead with a confidence that transcended the darkness, his 9 years of roaming this land with James burned into his memory like a map written in his very bones, guiding them, not along the easiest path, but along a route that took advantage of terrain the vehicles could not follow, through dense thickets and across rocky outcroppings, and down a steep ravine where they had to slide on their backsides, while Ranger picked his way down with the sure-footed grace of a mountain goat. They could hear voices now, men shouting coordinates to each other, the beams of hand-held spotlights sweeping the forest above them. And once they had to press themselves flat against the ground behind a fallen log, while a beam passed so close that Fiona could see the individual needles on the pine branches, inches from her face. They ran for what felt like hours, but was probably 30 minutes, their lungs burning and legs screaming, Ranger always ahead, always knowing which direction to go, leading them in a wide arc that brought them back toward the Forest Service road, but from an angle that avoided the main search area. When they finally burst from the tree line and saw Sarah's sedan sitting exactly where they had left it, unmolested and waiting in the darkness, Fiona felt tears of relief stream down her face as they threw themselves inside, Sarah's hands shaking so badly she could barely get the key in the ignition. As they pulled away without headlights, navigating by starlight for the first quarter-mile, Fiona looked back through the rear window and saw multiple sets of headlights converging on the section of fence where they had cut through. At least 5 vehicles now, maybe 6, their searchlights sweeping the forest in an expanding pattern. They had made it out by minutes, perhaps only seconds, and as Sarah finally turned on the headlights and accelerated down the mountain road, the magnitude of what they had done settled over them like a weight. They had the evidence now, concrete proof of the contamination James had died trying to expose. But Apex knew they had been on the property, knew someone was asking the dangerous questions again, and the game had just escalated from surveillance and threats to active pursuit. Sarah had contacts at an independent environmental testing laboratory in Bozeman, a facility that contracted with the state EPA and had a reputation for rigorous analysis and unimpeachable results. And she drove there the morning after their nighttime infiltration, the sealed water and soil samples packed in a cooler in her trunk like evidence from a crime scene, which in every meaningful sense they were. The lead chemist, a thin, serious man named Dr. Howard Chen, who happened to be Sarah's uncle, agreed to expedite the analysis when she explained the circumstances, and he called them back to the lab 72 hours later, with results that transformed their suspicions into documented catastrophe. Dr. Chen's face was grim as he led them into his office and spread the test reports across his desk, the columns of numbers and chemical abbreviations meaning little to Fiona, but clearly devastating to the professionals who understood their implications. The water samples contained toxic levels of trichloroethylene, an industrial solvent used in degreasing operations, at concentrations nearly 40 times the EPA's maximum contaminant level, along with dangerous amounts of lead, arsenic, chromium, and benzene, a known carcinogen that had no safe exposure threshold. The soil samples revealed even worse contamination, saturated with polychlorinated biphenyls, and asbestos fibers that could only have come from demolition of old buildings, the kind of hazardous waste that federal law required, be transported to specially licensed disposal facilities at enormous expense, not dumped in mountain streams where it would leach into groundwater for generations. Dr. Chen pulled up a topographical map on his computer and traced the watershed with his finger, showing how the contaminated stream fed into Blackstone Creek, which in turn flowed down through the valley, providing irrigation water for 2 neighboring cattle ranches, and eventually feeding into the reservoir that supplied drinking water to the small community of Pine Haven, population 347, about 15 miles downstream from the dump site. The contamination, he explained in a voice tight with professional outrage, had likely been occurring for years based on the soil saturation levels, which meant that hundreds of people and thousands of livestock had been exposed to carcinogenic compounds through their water supply, an environmental crime of staggering magnitude that would require years and millions of dollars to remediate. Sarah was already making notes, her reporter's mind calculating the scope of the story, while Fiona sat in stunned silence as the full weight of what her father had discovered settled over her like a physical burden. This was not just about her stolen inheritance, or even about justice for James's murder, though those things remained vitally important. This was about entire families whose health had been compromised, about children who had drunk poisoned water, about ranchers whose cattle had grazed on contaminated land, about an entire community that had been treated as expendable by a corporation that valued profit over human life. Dr. Chen handed Sarah a flash drive containing his complete analysis and stated that he was prepared to submit these findings to the State Environmental Agency immediately and to testify in any legal proceedings that resulted, his professional credentials and the laboratory's reputation lending unassailable weight to evidence that Apex would find impossible to dismiss or discredit. The response from Apex came with terrifying speed, a coordinated assault that began less than 24 hours after Dr. Chen submitted his preliminary findings to the State Environmental Agency, as if someone within the system had immediately alerted the corporation to the threat. Fiona returned to the Pineview Motel after a tense meeting with Sarah and Sterling to find her door standing open, the frame splintered where it had been forced, and the interior of her small room transformed into a scene of deliberate destruction. Every drawer had been emptied onto the floor, the mattress slashed open with a knife, her meager belongings scattered and trampled, the bathroom cabinet torn from the wall, and even the heating grate removed, exposing the ductwork beneath in a search that had been thorough and violent. The intruders had found nothing, because Fiona, following Sarah's advice and her own growing paranoia, had moved James's journal, the estate documents, copies of the lab reports, and the remaining physical samples to a safety deposit box at Copper Ridge Community Bank 2 days earlier, keeping only photocopies in a location the searchers would never find. Ranger had been with her at the meeting, sparing him from whatever confrontation might have occurred, and as they stood surveying the wreckage together, the dog's low, continuous growl suggested he could smell the intruder's presence in every violated corner. The motel manager, the same elderly man who had dismissed her concerns about the watching truck, was apologetic but notably reluctant to call the sheriff's department, mumbling something about insurance and suggesting she might want to find alternative accommodations. 20 minutes later, Tom Whitaker called Sarah's cell phone, his voice shaking with a fear that made him sound decades older, reporting that his cabin had been ransacked in the same systematic way, his few possessions destroyed, and a dead crow nailed to his front door with a note that read simply, "Keep quiet, old man." May called next, her usually steady voice tight with worry, saying that 2 men in expensive suits had come into the diner asking detailed questions about Fiona, where she went, who she talked to, what she did with her time, questions May had deflected with the stubborn vagueness of a woman who had survived 70 Montana winters and knew when to reveal nothing. The final blow came that evening when Sarah turned on the local news, and they watched Derek Garrison standing in front of the county courthouse in a perfectly tailored suit, his silver hair gleaming in the television lights, delivering a statement that was clearly designed to destroy Fiona's credibility before she could become a serious threat. He spoke with practiced concern about his troubled niece, a young woman who had grown up in institutional care and was struggling with grief over a father she had never known, making wild accusations about corporate conspiracies because she could not accept the legal reality that her inheritance had been properly administered years before she came of age, displaying signs of mental instability that worried him deeply as her only living family. The performance was masterful, painting Fiona as delusional while positioning himself as the concerned relative, and she watched in impotent fury as he effectively poisoned any public sympathy she might have claimed, transforming her from victim to unreliable narrator in the court of public opinion. After the break-ins and Derek's televised character assassination, Fiona and Ranger moved into Sarah's rented cabin, a small weathered structure on the edge of town that the reporter had leased month to month for the past 2 years while pursuing her investigation into Apex. And it was here, 3 days after the ransacking of the motel, that Ranger began to exhibit behavior that was both strange and strangely familiar. The dog had been restless since the attacks, pacing the small cabin's perimeter, and periodically checking the windows with a vigilance that suggested he understood they were being hunted. But on this particular evening, his attention became fixated on a specific spot near the corner of the main room, a section of the worn wooden floor that looked no different from any other plank. He began to whine, a high-pitched, urgent sound that Fiona had learned meant he had discovered something important, and he pawed repeatedly at a particular floorboard, his claws scratching uselessly against the aged wood, his frustration mounting as he looked back at her, with amber eyes that seemed to plead for understanding. Sarah, who had been working at her laptop compiling their evidence into a coherent narrative, stopped and watched the dog's behavior with growing interest, noting that Ranger was not randomly scratching, but focusing on one board with the kind of precision that suggested recognition, rather than mere canine curiosity. Fiona knelt beside him, running her hands over the floorboard he had indicated, and felt what her eyes had missed, the subtle give that indicated this board was not nailed down like its neighbors, but merely sitting in place. And when she worked her fingers into the gap and lifted, the plank came up easily to reveal a dark rectangular space beneath. Nestled in the cavity between the floor joists was a sealed metal ammunition box, military surplus from the look of it, its olive drab paint scratched and dusty, but its rubber gasket still intact, and Sarah's hands trembled as she lifted it out and set it on the small kitchen table where they had spent so many hours planning their next moves. The box was not locked, just latched, and inside they found a treasure trove of evidence that took their breath away, the original physical proof that James had compiled before his death. There were dozens of photographs printed on photopaper, images of Apex trucks with visible company logos dumping barrels and construction debris into the mountain streams, date and time stamps in the corner of each image, providing an irrefutable timeline of criminal activity. There was a folder of correspondence, letters and emails between James and an EPA investigator named David Martinez, detailing Martinez's plans to conduct a site inspection and his concerns about local interference, and paper-clipped to the last letter was a newspaper obituary from 6 years ago, reporting that Martinez had died in a single-vehicle car accident on a mountain highway. His death ruled accidental, despite the suspicious timing, just 2 weeks after his correspondence with James. Most damning of all was a USB drive wrapped carefully in an anti-static bag, and when Sarah plugged it into her laptop, with hands that shook with anticipation and dread, they found themselves watching video footage that James had secretly recorded. Night vision footage showing the dumping operations in progress, capturing license plates and faces, and most incredibly, audio recordings of conversations between men who discussed the operation with the casual callousness of criminals who believed they were beyond consequences. Tom's voice crackled through the laptop speakers on one recording, telling Sarah that James had given him this box years ago, asking him to hide it somewhere safe during repairs to this very cabin, a cabin that had belonged to James's friend before Sarah rented it. And Ranger, who had been just a young dog then, had remembered where his master had hidden his most precious evidence, carrying the knowledge in his loyal heart until the moment when it was needed most. They spent the entire night reviewing the contents of the USB drive, Sarah's laptop screen casting a flickering blue glow across their exhausted faces as the evidence unfolded in a sequence so damning that even Fiona, who had suspected the worst, felt physically sick watching the truth of her father's murder documented in digital precision. The first files were security camera footage, grainy night vision recordings that James had captured using motion-activated game cameras he had strategically positioned near the dumping sites, and the videos showed exactly what his journal had described. Apex trucks arriving in the darkness, their company logos clearly visible even in the green-tinted footage, backing up to the culvert pipes and offloading 55-gallon drums marked with hazardous waste symbols, construction debris wrapped in plastic sheeting. And in one particularly damning sequence, workers in Tyvek suits and respirators handling materials so toxic they required protective equipment while dumping them directly into streams that fed the community's water supply. Each video file was date-stamped and GPS tagged, creating an irrefutable timeline of criminal activity spanning nearly 2 years. But it was the audio files that transformed their case from environmental crime to conspiracy and murder. James had recorded conversations, either through a hidden microphone or a device left running in his ranch office, and the voices that emerged from Sarah's speakers belonged to men discussing the James Garrison problem, with the cold calculation of executives managing an inconvenient business obstacle. Derek's voice was unmistakable, his refined tone made obscene by the words he spoke, telling Apex Vice President Michael Thornton that his brother had become a serious threat, that James had been documenting everything and making contact with federal investigators, and that the situation needed to be resolved permanently before the EPA could launch a formal investigation that would expose not just the Montana dumping operation, but Apex's identical schemes in 4 other states. Thornton's response, recorded with digital clarity, was equally damning, stating that the company was prepared to compensate Derek appropriately for taking care of the family matter, that $500,000 beyond the eventual ranch sale price would be transferred to an offshore account, and that certain contractors who specialized in making problems disappear could be made available if Derek preferred not to handle it personally. The conversation, date-stamped exactly 14 days before James's death, continued with discussions of how the accident should be staged, Thornton suggesting a riding accident in remote terrain where investigations would be cursory and witnesses non-existent, and Derek agreeing with the eagerness that made Fiona's stomach turn as she listened to her uncle casually planning her father's murder for money. There were additional recordings, conversations between Thornton and Dr. Raymond Price, the corrupt coroner, arranging payment for a death certificate that would ask no uncomfortable questions, and a chilling discussion between Derek and Sheriff Roy Madden's predecessor, a man named Lewis who had retired 2 years ago, about ensuring the investigation would be closed quickly and filed away without scrutiny. Sarah methodically copied every file, creating multiple backups on separate drives, her journalist's training evident in the meticulous way she documented chain of custody and verified the authenticity of the timestamps, while Fiona sat in stunned silence, processing the reality that her father had not only been murdered, but had recorded his killers planning the act, had left behind a complete record of the conspiracy, and had hidden it so well that it had taken 5 years and a loyal dog's memory to bring it back into the light. Sheriff Roy Madden was a man in his late 50s who had spent 30 years wearing the badge in Flathead County, his weathered face and calloused hands testament to decades of serving a community he loved. And when Sarah Chen and Fiona Garrison appeared at his office requesting a private meeting, bringing with them a laptop and several USB drives, he agreed with the weary resignation of someone who suspected his peaceful final years before retirement were about to become very complicated. They sat in his small, cluttered office that smelled of coffee and old paper, and for the next 2 hours, they walked him through the evidence, playing the audio recordings of Derek Garrison and Apex executives planning James's murder, showing him the video footage of illegal dumping, presenting Dr. Chen's laboratory analysis of the contaminated water and laying out the forged estate documents that had stolen Fiona's inheritance. Madden's face grew progressively graver as the evidence accumulated, his jaw tightening and his weathered hands clenching into fists on his desk. And when the final recording ended with Derek discussing payment for murder, the sheriff sat in profound silence, staring at nothing, the weight of 30 years of integrity pressing against the reality of his situation. He admitted, his voice heavy with something that might have been shame, that he had received pressure from county officials over the past few years to dismiss complaints about Apex, to treat their security concerns as priority, and civilian grievances as nuisances, that there had been subtle suggestions that cooperation would be remembered favorably when budget allocations were decided, and that obstruction would have consequences for department funding and his pension. He was 5 years from retirement, with a wife whose medical bills from her cancer treatment had depleted their savings, and every practical consideration, every voice of self-preservation in his head screamed at him to hand this problem back to them, to say it was beyond his jurisdiction, to protect the peaceful conclusion to his career that he had earned through 3 decades of service. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, Fiona holding her breath while Sarah sat perfectly still, both women understanding that this single decision would determine whether James Garrison's evidence would see the light of justice or disappear into the same bureaucratic darkness that had swallowed his death investigation 5 years ago. Finally, Sheriff Madden reached for his phone, but instead of calling the county prosecutor or the board of supervisors, instead of following the chain of command that had been compromised by Apex's money and influence, he dialed the direct number for the FBI field office in Helena that he had obtained years ago during a joint task force operation. And when that call was complete, he placed a second call to the Montana Attorney General's office, speaking with quiet authority about corruption, murder, and environmental catastrophe, going over everyone's heads and burning every bridge that connected him to the local power structure that had failed its duty to protect its citizens. The attack came that very night, as if Derek and his Apex handlers had been monitoring the sheriff's office and understood with desperate clarity that their window to silence Fiona and destroy the evidence was closing with terminal finality. And it began at 11:30, when the sound of vehicles pulling up outside Sarah's cabin shattered the tense silence in which they had been waiting, half expecting exactly this response. Fiona looked up from the couch where she had been unable to sleep, Ranger already on his feet with his body rigid and a deep, continuous growl vibrating in his chest. And through the window she could see 2 dark SUVs, their headlights killed, and 4 figures emerging with the purposeful movements of men who had come to do violence. What Derek and the 3 Apex security personnel did not know, could not have known, was that Sheriff Madden had anticipated exactly this desperate move, understanding with the tactical mind of a 30-year law enforcement veteran that cornered predators with everything to lose would make one final strike before the federal authorities arrived at dawn to take control of the investigation. The sheriff had stationed 2 of his most trusted deputies in an unmarked vehicle hidden in the tree line 50 yards from the cabin, and he himself waited in a 3rd vehicle on the access road, all of them wearing body cameras and armed with warrants that had been expedited through a judge who owed Madden favors from 3 decades of professional integrity. Derek reached the cabin door first, his expensive suit replaced by dark, tactical clothing that made him look like a middle-aged man playing soldier, and he did not bother knocking or calling out, but instead stepped back and let one of the Apex security men, a thick-shouldered brute who moved with the efficiency of former military training, kick the door with sufficient force to splinter the frame and send it crashing inward. The moment Derek stepped across the threshold, before he could register the scene or shout his demands, Ranger launched himself from his position beside the couch, 90 pounds of loyal fury, driven by 5 years of grief and the primal understanding that this man was a threat to his master's daughter, and the dog's attack was not the wild snapping of an untrained animal, but the precise, devastating strike of a working shepherd who had been trained to take down threats. Ranger hit Derek at chest height, his momentum and weight driving the older man backward and down, and his jaws clamped onto Derek's forearm with sufficient force that the crack of breaking bone was audible even over Derek's scream of pain and terror, the dog shaking his head viciously while maintaining his grip, pinning the would-be attacker to the floor. The three security personnel hesitated for a critical second, hands moving toward weapons they carried in shoulder holsters. But that second was all Sheriff Madden needed, as he and his deputies burst through the shattered doorway, with weapons drawn and voices commanding everyone to get on the ground immediately, the body cameras recording every moment of the confrontation. The security men, professionals who understood when a situation was lost, immediately complied, dropping to their knees with hands raised. But Derek, even with Ranger's teeth still embedded in his arm and his face twisted in agony, began screaming threats that echoed through the small cabin with the desperate fury of a man watching his entire world collapse. He shrieked about his lawyers, about powerful friends in the state capital and Washington, about how the sheriff would regret this, how Fiona was a delusional orphan whose accusations would be dismissed, how Apex had resources and connections that would bury them all, his voice rising to a hysterical pitch, until Madden ordered one of his deputies to muzzle him with a warning about obstruction charges. Fiona gave Ranger the release command, and the dog reluctantly let go, backing away to stand beside her, his muzzle stained with Derek's blood, his amber eyes still fixed on the man who'd murdered his first master. And as the deputies cuffed Derek and the three security personnel and read them their rights, the Miranda warnings delivered in flat professional tones seemed inadequate to the magnitude of justice that was finally, after 5 years of waiting, beginning to unfold in the cold Montana night. The FBI arrived within 48 hours of Derek's arrest, a team of 6 special agents from the Helena Field office, accompanied by forensic specialists and environmental crimes, investigators who transformed the quiet mountain town of Copper Ridge into the center of a federal investigation that would eventually reach into 4 states and implicate dozens of individuals in a conspiracy that had been operating for nearly a decade. The agents treated the Garrison Ranch as an active crime scene, cutting through the locked Apex gates with bolt cutters and federal warrants, and what they found in their systematic 3-day search exceeded even the damning evidence that James had compiled. 17 separate dumping sites across the property's northern section, thousands of barrels of toxic waste buried in shallow pits, contaminated soil extending 30 feet deep in some locations, and a paper trail of falsified disposal manifests that documented Apex's systematic diversion of hazardous materials from licensed facilities to this remote mountain location where they believed no one would ever look. The FBI's forensic team also traveled to Blackstone Canyon, the remote location where James Garrison had allegedly fallen from his horse 5 years earlier, and what they discovered confirmed Tom Whitaker's suspicions. The site had never been properly investigated, critical evidence had never been collected, and the physical layout of the terrain made the official accident narrative implausible, if not impossible, with their own riding expert stating flatly that an experienced horseman would have had to be pushed or thrown deliberately to land in the position where James's body had been found. Meanwhile, the Bureau's Financial Crimes Unit tore through Apex Development Corporation's banking records, following electronic trails of money that connected company accounts to shell corporations in the Cayman Islands, and from there to payments made to Derek Garrison, Dr. Raymond Price, 2 county commissioners, the former sheriff, and a network of local officials whose cooperation had been purchased with systematic bribes disguised as consulting fees and campaign contributions. The Environmental Protection Agency arrived simultaneously, their hazmat teams in white protective suits conducting soil and water testing that confirmed Dr. Chen's findings and expanded the scope of the disaster. The contamination had spread through the entire Blackstone Creek watershed, affecting not just the 2 neighboring ranches and Pine Haven community, but extending 15 miles downstream into the main valley, potentially impacting water supplies for nearly 2,000 people, with preliminary health data showing elevated cancer rates in the affected area that would require decades of epidemiological study to fully document. Within 72 hours of the FBI's arrival, the EPA declared the Garrison Ranch and surrounding watershed a Superfund site, a designation that triggered federal cleanup authority and potentially billions of dollars in remediation costs, and they announced that Apex Development Corporation would be held financially liable for the full cost of restoration, a number that would almost certainly exceed the company's total assets and drive it into bankruptcy. The story broke nationally on the fourth day, CNN and the major networks sending crews to Copper Ridge, where they filmed the FBI's ongoing investigation, interviewed residents of Pine Haven who had drunk contaminated water for years, and broadcast footage of the dumping sites that shocked viewers across the country, while newspapers from the New York Times to the Washington Post ran front-page stories about corporate environmental crimes and the murder of a whistleblower that read like a thriller but was documented truth. Fiona found herself at the center of a media storm she had never anticipated. Reporters requesting interviews, photographers capturing images of her standing with Ranger at the locked gates that had once kept her from her inheritance, and producers offering book and movie deals for a story that was still unfolding in real time. But through it all, she remained focused on a single purpose: ensuring that her father's sacrifice had not been in vain, that the evidence he had died gathering would finally bring justice not just for him, but for all the victims of Apex's greed. Through the investigation, as FBI agents interviewed former neighbors and old friends of James Garrison, as they compiled a complete picture of the man whose murder they were now proving in meticulous detail, Fiona began to learn the truth about her father. And the story that emerged was both heartbreaking and redemptive in ways she had never imagined during her 18 years of believing she had been abandoned. The facts came to her in pieces, fragments assembled from interviews and old letters that Sterling provided from his files, and the picture they painted was of a man destroyed by grief and rebuilt by love. James had been 23 years old when he married Catherine Moore, a schoolteacher from Billings, with a gentle laugh and dreams of a family, and they had been deliriously happy for the 2 years before Catherine's pregnancy, planning for their daughter's arrival with the naive optimism of young parents who believed their love could overcome anything. But Catherine had died in childbirth, a hemorrhage that the rural hospital's understaffed emergency room could not control, and she had lived just long enough to hold her daughter once and make James promise that their baby girl would be loved, would be safe, would know she was wanted. The grief, according to those who knew him then, had broken something fundamental in James Garrison, transforming a capable young ranch hand into a hollow shell who could barely function, who drank to silence the memories, who looked at his infant daughter and saw only the face of the wife he had lost, the unbearable reminder of his failure to protect the woman he loved. After 3 months of trying and failing to care for a baby while drowning in depression and alcohol, James had made the most painful decision of his life, placing Fiona in what was supposed to be temporary foster care through the state agency, signing papers that he barely read through tears that would not stop, telling the social worker that he needed 6 months to get help, to find stable work, to become the father his daughter deserved, and then he would return for her, and they would build the life Catherine had dreamed of. But James had been too shattered to navigate the bureaucracy of the system, moving from ranch to ranch as a transient worker, losing the contact information for the caseworker, missing appointments because he was working cattle drives in remote locations with no phone access. And when he finally sobered up and returned to claim his daughter 8 months later, he discovered that the case had been transferred to a different office, that the records had been misfiled during a computer system upgrade, that his parental rights had been terminated in absentia when he failed to appear at a hearing he never knew was scheduled. He had spent the next 15 years searching, hiring private investigators when he could afford them, filing requests with every state agency, following leads that went nowhere, watching his daughter grow up in a series of photographs provided by sympathetic social workers who bent rules to help him, knowing she was out there but unable to penetrate the walls of bureaucracy, and lost paperwork that separated them. The ranch, Tom told Fiona, through tears as they sat in May's diner, surrounded by the FBI investigation swirling through town, had been James's grand plan, his final desperate attempt to create something worthy of his daughter, a home substantial enough that even the system could not ignore his claim, a legacy that would prove he had become the man Catherine had believed he could be. James had saved every dollar from his work, had taken out loans, had purchased the 2,000 acres of mountain land with the intention of building a cattle operation that would provide security for the daughter he would finally, after 15 years of searching, bring home. Derek Garrison was formally charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, forgery, obstruction of justice, and violation of federal environmental protection statutes, a cascade of charges that carried a combined potential sentence of life in prison without possibility of parole. And he sat in the Flathead County Jail, awaiting transfer to federal custody, his expensive suits replaced by an orange jumpsuit, his silver hair unwashed, and his face haggard with the knowledge that the life he had built on blood money and betrayal was finished. The federal prosecutors, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney Margaret Chen, who had flown in from Helena specifically to handle this case, were building a prosecution so airtight that Derek's attorneys, a team of criminal defense lawyers from Denver, who charged $500 an hour, advised him with brutal honesty that his only hope of avoiding death in prison was full cooperation and a plea agreement. It took 3 days of isolation in his cell, 3 days of facing the reality that his powerful friends had abandoned him the moment his usefulness ended, 3 days of understanding that Apex Development Corporation was already negotiating its own plea deal and would sacrifice him without hesitation to protect the executives higher up the chain before Derek Garrison finally broke. The confession, delivered in a windowless interview room with his attorneys present and federal agents recording every word, was a torrent of guilt and self-justification and desperate attempts to portray himself as a victim of forces beyond his control. He admitted that Apex executives, specifically Vice President Michael Thornton and CEO Richard Castellano, had approached him 6 years ago with a proposal that had seemed elegant in its simplicity. They needed his brother's land for a dumping operation that would save the company millions in disposal costs, and they offered Derek $500,000 plus the full sale price of the ranch if he could acquire the property by any means necessary. When James refused to sell and began investigating the contamination, when he started talking to EPA investigators and compiling evidence that threatened to expose not just the Montana operation, but Apex's identical schemes in Wyoming, Idaho, Oregon, and Colorado, the executives had made it clear to Derek that his brother had become an unacceptable liability, and they gave him an ultimatum that was not really a choice at all. Either he would help handle the James Garrison problem, or Apex would ensure that certain financial crimes Derek had committed in his real estate business would come to light, charges that would send him to prison and destroy his reputation. Derek's voice shook as he described forging his brother's signature on the estate documents, as he admitted providing an alibi for the night of James's death, while knowing that 2 contractors hired by Apex, men whose names he claimed not to know, but whom federal investigators would later identify as Marcus Devlin and Stephen Price, ex-military operatives who specialized in making murders look like accidents, were riding into Blackstone Canyon to push James Garrison off the overlook where he had gone to photograph the sunset, a location they had scouted in advance and chosen for its remote isolation and the plausible narrative of a horseback riding accident. The confession opened the floodgates, providing federal prosecutors with the evidence they needed to execute a coordinated series of arrests that happened simultaneously across 3 states. Dr. Raymond Price was taken into custody at his retirement home in Arizona, charged with falsifying death certificates and accepting bribes. County Commissioners Harold Walsh and Dennis Keller were arrested at their homes in Montana, charged with accepting illegal payments and conspiracy to obstruct environmental investigations. And 4 Apex Development Corporation executives, including Michael Thornton and CEO Richard Castellano, were arrested at the company's headquarters in Denver, led out in handcuffs in front of news cameras, while employees watched in stunned silence, charged with murder conspiracy, racketeering, environmental crimes, and operating a criminal enterprise facing sentences that would ensure none of them would ever walk free again. The court order that voided Derek's fraudulent sale came down on a cold November morning, the federal judge ruling that every transaction built on forged documents was null and void from the moment of signing, which meant that the Garrison Ranch, all 2,000 acres of mountain meadow and pine forest and poisoned streams, reverted to its rightful owner, 18-year-old Fiona Garrison, who stood in the courthouse holding the deed with hands that trembled not from fear, but from the overwhelming weight of a dream finally realized. Apex Development Corporation, facing billions in cleanup costs, hundreds of personal injury lawsuits from residents of Pine Haven and the surrounding communities, and criminal restitution orders that exceeded their total assets, declared bankruptcy within a week, their stock worthless, their executives in federal custody, their corporate empire dissolved into a cautionary tale that business schools would study for generations. The Environmental Protection Agency moved on to the property, with a timeline measured in years and a budget measured in hundreds of millions of dollars, heavy machinery arriving to excavate contaminated soil, water treatment systems being installed to filter the streams, and white-suited technicians conducting endless tests that would continue long after Fiona was an old woman. The remediation of her father's land, a multi-generational project that would outlive everyone involved in creating the damage. Tom Whitaker, despite being in his 70s with arthritic hands and a back that protested every morning, appeared at Fiona's temporary residence in May's spare room and announced with quiet dignity that if she would have him, he would serve as her foreman again, that he owed it to James to help his daughter build the ranch her father had dreamed of, and together they began the slow work of restoration. May organized the community with the efficiency of a woman who had spent decades managing breakfast rushes and resolving small-town disputes, coordinating volunteers who brought tools and expertise and casseroles, neighbors who had once been too afraid to speak James's name, now eager to repair the ranch buildings that had fallen into disrepair during 5 years of Apex's neglect, fixing broken fences and patching roofs, and restoring the corrals where cattle would someday graze again. On a clear December afternoon, when the first snow had begun to dust the high peaks and the air carried the crystalline clarity that only comes in the mountains, Fiona walked the land with Ranger at her side, the old dog moving slowly but with obvious joy through terrain he had roamed with James years before, and she stood on a hillside overlooking the valley, her boots on soil that was legally and finally hers, and understood with profound clarity that she was not just the owner of this land, but its guardian, and the keeper of her father's legacy, and the protector of the truth he had died defending. 6 months after the court order that restored her inheritance, Fiona stood on the wide porch of the ranch house that was now truly hers, watching the sun descend toward the jagged silhouette of the mountain peaks, painting the sky in colors that seemed impossible, brilliant oranges and deep purples that reflected off the windows of the outbuildings, where the lights were beginning to glow in the gathering dusk. The ranch was alive again, not as it had been in James's time, but as something new, built on the foundation of his sacrifice and a determination to honor what he had tried to leave her. She had enrolled in online courses through Montana State University, studying ranch management and agricultural business and environmental restoration, spending her mornings in classes delivered through a laptop on the kitchen table and her afternoons working the land alongside Tom Whitaker and the 3 young ranch hands he had hired, teaching them the skills that James had once taught him, passing down knowledge that connected generations in an unbroken chain of stewardship and respect for the mountains that surrounded them. The cattle were coming in the spring, 40 head of Black Angus, that would be the foundation of a herd she planned to build slowly and sustainably, working with the EPA's timeline for land restoration and grazing only in areas that had been certified clean, a process that would take years, but which she approached with the patient determination of someone who had learned that the most valuable things were worth waiting for. Tom moved with the careful deliberation of age, but with a renewed sense of purpose that had taken years off his weathered face, his guilt over his silence during the dark years, finally absolved by his work helping James's daughter reclaim what had been stolen. And he had become not just her foreman, but her teacher and her friend, filling in the gaps in her knowledge about the father she had never known, telling stories that brought James to life in ways that the journal and the evidence never could. On the hill overlooking the valley, at the spot where James had loved to watch the sunset according to Tom's memories, they had erected a memorial stone, a massive piece of granite that had been pulled from the ranch's own soil, polished smooth and engraved with a bronze plaque that caught the last rays of sunlight, and read simply, James Garrison, 1975 to 2019. He fought for the truth. He died protecting this land. His daughter carries his legacy forward. Fiona visited the memorial every evening, sometimes speaking to the stone as if her father could hear her, telling him about her day, about the challenges and small victories, about the home she was building from the ashes of his dreams. And she believed in the way that grief allows us to believe impossible things, that somehow he knew that somewhere beyond the mountains and the sky, he was finally at peace, knowing she had found her way to the land he had meant for her. Ranger lay beside her on the porch now, his muzzle almost entirely white with age, his movements slow and careful, the years catching up to the loyal dog who had waited 5 years for someone to hear his message. But his amber eyes were still bright with intelligence, and his devotion to Fiona was as absolute as it had been to James, the connection between them a living bridge across the chasm of loss that separated them from the man they both mourned. May visited weekly, bringing food and gossip, and the quiet companionship of a woman who had become the grandmother Fiona had never had. And Sarah Chen was finishing her book about the Apex conspiracy, a work of investigative journalism that would win awards and expose similar schemes across the country, changing environmental protection laws and inspiring a generation of journalists to pursue truth regardless of the powerful interests arrayed against them. The legal settlements from Apex's bankruptcy were still being calculated, but Fiona would eventually receive compensation that would ensure the ranch's financial stability for decades, though no amount of money could restore the 15 years she had lost with her father, or bring back the man who had searched for her with desperate devotion until his last breath, as darkness settled over the valley, and the first stars began to appear in the vast Montana sky. Fiona wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and stroked Ranger's greying head, feeling the solid warmth of him against her leg, and understood with a clarity that brought tears to her eyes that she had found more than an inheritance in these mountains, more than justice for her father's murder or restitution for a theft that had nearly succeeded. She had found her purpose, her identity, her home, transformed from an 18-year-old orphan with nothing but a duffel bag and a bus ticket into the guardian of 2,000 acres of healing land, the keeper of her father's memory, and the living proof that truth, no matter how long it takes, will eventually claw its way into the light.